Name of this chapter is Basic Macroeconomic Relationships, and the subtitle is What Determines the Components of GDP. What we're going to do in this chapter is discuss basically the four components of GDP, although we won't say at this point very much about government consumption or net exports. I will have a few comments at the end. The two main ones we're going to discuss are consumption and investment. These are two that are extremely important, especially consumption in terms of size, and in terms of investment, it's instability. Consumption is the largest component of GDP. It makes up about 70% of the gross domestic product. There are several theories of consumption, but we're going to introduce a relatively simple one here. We are assuming, and it makes complete sense here, that the major determinant of consumption is income. Makes sense. Now you might say, well, gee, can't I spend more of my income? For short periods of time you can, but that simply then impacts future consumption. As income rises, we tend to consume more. There are also going to be some non-income determinants, which we're going to discuss. So what is the relationship between consumption and income? Well, that relationship is known as the consumption schedule or consumption function. This is based on a macro measure, meaning a relationship between current income in the United States to current consumption in the United States. So again, we're making this fairly simple and straightforward. We have two different measures of this relationship. The first is the average propensity to consume. This is simply consumption divided by income. So for instance, if national income is $500 billion and consumption is $450 billion and APC is 450 over 500 or 0.9. APC will probably fall as income rises, simply because as your income rises, you're going to consume a smaller portion of the increase than at lower incomes. The second measure is based on increases in income. What happens to consumption as income rises? Well, this measure is known as the marginal propensity to consume. We love marginal measures in economics, and you're going to find that throughout your studying of economics, you're going to see a lot of discussion of marginal measures. It's the change in consumption divided by the change in income. Thus, if national income increases from $500 billion to $600 billion, and income increases from $450 to $530 billion, then the MPC is 80 divided by 100. The 80 is the change in consumption, 530 minus 450. The change in income is 600 minus 500. So our MPC becomes 0.8. In economics, marginal measures are usually more useful, as we pointed out, than average measures, and so we're going to focus on that marginal propensity to consume. Graphically, the relationship would look something like this one below. We see consumption on the vertical axis, income on the horizontal axis, and the slope of that line is going to be the MPC. Notice it starts above zero, although national income is never going to drop to zero. In theory, this suggests that you will have some consumption even when income drops to zero, simply because you have to continue to consume something. So as indicated, the slope of the consumption function is the MPC, and consumption is going to be not starting at zero, but actually above zero even when income is zero. Now, of course, as I indicated, we're never going to have national income zero. Related to consumption is savings. We're making a simple assumption, and that is that you can only use your income for consumption or savings. Thus, C plus S equals Y, where C is consumption, S is savings, and Y is income. We always use Y for income. Can't tell you why. Thus, Y minus C equals savings, or income minus consumption equals savings. So the relationship between savings and income is similar to the relationship between consumption. Thus, the average propensity to save, APS, is savings divided by income. Above, we assumed a national income of $500 billion and consumption of $450 billion. This means savings is $50 billion, 500 minus 450, and the APS is 50 divided by 500, or 0.1. The other measure is the marginal propensity to save, and it's the change in savings divided by the change in income. When income rose to $600 billion, then savings rose to $70 billion, an increase of $20 billion. So the MPS is $20 billion divided by $100 billion, or 0.2. The graph below shows the savings function. Notice since the consumption function started above zero, this one starts below zero. And then the slope of the savings function is equal to the MPS. So the slope of that line is the MPS. So on the vertical axis you have savings, on the horizontal axis you have income, and again the slope of the line is the MPS. So the slope of the savings function is the MPS, and also notice if consumption is higher in income at points and savings is less than zero, or you have dis-savings. In other words, you're drawing down past savings. Remember, this is all based on current income, current consumption, current savings. So you may have a stock of savings from previously which you can draw down. So what is the relationship between the APC and the APS? Well, since y equals c plus s, then the APC plus the APS has to equal 1. In other words, you have to spend 100% of either spend, consume, or save 100% of your income, and of course 1% is 100% is 1, meaning all of your income has to either consumed or saved, or 100% must be consumed or saved. Also, MPC equals MPS equals 1, since an increase in income must be either consumed or saved. So the increase in income, 100% of it has to be consumed or saved. Are there some things that can influence your consumption out of current income other than income? Absolutely. And those are called non-determinants of consumption. One of those is wealth. If you have a lot of wealth, your current consumption out of your current income could go up. Why? Well, you've got plenty of cushion. You can always blow your paycheck this week, but still have some money that you can access. Obviously, if you have no money to access, it's a little more difficult. So if I had $1 million in wealth and blow this week's paycheck, it doesn't matter much, and if I have no wealth, it leaves me no cushion. The other thing that can impact it is borrowing. If we have the ability to borrow, then you can always spend more than your current income, because you can always borrow to cover consumption. And of course, if you have no borrowing ability, you can't do that. Expectations always plays a part. If I believe I'll lose my job soon, then I'll probably reduce my consumption as a portion of my income, but if I think I'll get a raise, I may spend more of it. Finally, real interest rates are a determinant. Real interest rate is the real cost of borrowing. And real interest rates are simply the nominal interest rate, or the stated interest rate, minus the inflation rate. So if nominal interest rates are 10% and inflation is 4%, then the real interest rates are 6%. If real interest rates are low, we'll probably borrow and spend more. If they're high, then we'll borrow and spend less. And right now, real interest rates are extremely low. In the early 1980s, they got to extremely high rates of real interest rates. The prime rate hit 21%. And what happened was, this was all to bring down inflation. It did, but the interest rates didn't go down as fast as the inflation rate. So real interest rates, for instance, on cars and housing, went to 12, 13, 14%. We can see the consumption function below, and the items we've mentioned will either shift it to the right, which we can see the arrow pointed to the right, or the left. And I'm going to summarize those here in a few seconds. In the previous slide, we show the consumption shifting left, or the consumption function shifting left. This would steepen the curve as shown, meaning the MPC would rise. What causes this? Well, increased wealth, increased borrowing, higher expectations, or lower interest rates. So all of those would cause a shift to the left. We also see an arrow showing a shift to the right. This means the MPC has fallen. This would be due to either less wealth or a decline in wealth, less borrowing, or a decline in borrowing, lower or worse expectations, or higher interest rates, real interest rates. Investment is the second component of GDP. It is much less in consumption, but very important, It's also very unstable, and this can create problems. The major determinant of investment is real interest rates, or I is a function of R, where R is the interest rate and I is investment. And we're talking here private investment, by the way. The other major determinant is the expected return. If the expected return on an investment is higher than the interest rate, then the investment makes sense, and you'll probably be undertaken. If not, it won't be undertaken. So below is the investment demand schedule, which, by the way, is really called the marginal efficiency of investment. So on the vertical axis, you have the real interest rate. On the horizontal axis, you have investment. So as the interest rates come down, investment is going to tend to go up. Conversely, if interest rates go up, investment's going to go down. So when I talk about the early 1980s and very high real interest rates, we saw very low levels of investment. And then, of course, as those came down, investment increased. Now, right now, investment's not that high, but interest rates are low. So as we're going to see, there may be other things to influence this other than the interest rate. As previously discussed, this investment demand is determined by expected return and real interest rates, and investment declines as interest rates rise. There are several factors that will shift the curve, and these are not related to interest rates, but they may impact expected return. Below are the things that can cause the investment curve to shift. 1, acquisition, maintenance, and operating costs. 2, business taxes. 3, technological change. 4, stock of capital on hand. 5th is planned inventory changes, and 6th is expectations. We're going to discuss each of those a little bit. First of all, as acquisition, maintenance, and operating costs fall, then investment will rise even if interest rates do not change. Now, why is that? Well, for the most part, that makes capital cheaper. And for instance, what we really have in the country today is a declining price of capital. And remember what we mean by capital or investment. Capital is actually the means of production. So as computer technology, for instance, has gotten cheaper, it gets cheaper to change a lot of that technology. Simple example, 30 plus years ago, I had a bakery, and I bought a used cash register for $250, and it, I think, had something like what we call 2 departments, which means you could categorize your products into 2 categories. Today, you have 20 departments, and that cash register is still $250 new. So keep that in mind. I paid $250 for a used one. I get a new one today for $250 30 years later, and it has a lot more power. If business taxes falls, this is going to tend to increase expected returns and increase investment. So if we see taxes declining, we should get more investment. That's the great debate and a great argument about, should we reduce taxes? For instance, Trump administration says he wants to reduce corporate taxes to 15%. Will that help investment? Absolutely. You can cut them in other ways too, but we won't deal with those right now. Technological change will tend to increase investment. It really rarely is going to reduce it. Why? Well, mainly because people want to upgrade to more productive, better technology. What's really happening in the world today is capital doesn't really wear out. More than likely, it just becomes obsolete, and you have to buy new capital to keep up. I think I mentioned this, but a simple example, I have a computer in my attic that has Windows 95 on it. Really, can I do anything with that? Not actually. I keep a few financial records on it, and that's it. Software today would literally take up the entire hard drive. And, of course, it doesn't have as many bells and whistles as we have today. And so what happens is companies are going to buy new technology if it's going to increase their productivity, and often does. We see scanners in grocery stores, which I can remember when they didn't exist, and now I don't know of a store today that doesn't have them. Now, you could still use an old cash register, but it's much, much slower. Also, the stock of capital on hand is going to impact investment. If I have a factory sitting there half used, I'm not going to build another factory or add on to the existing one. Why? Because I've got excess capacity. And in fact, there is a measure in macroeconomics by the government, or that we measure what we call excess capacity. And so, or really it's something called capacity utilization rate. When it gets to about 85 to 88%, that's pretty much considered about as high as it can go, because there's a lot of capital out there that's just so obsolete we never use it. Then so if the stock of capital is really high, in other words, that capacity utilization rate's down around 40, 50, 60%, companies are not going to invest. They're not going to expand production because they can't sell it. Then there's planned inventory changes. Remember, inventory is one of the items that we include in investment. If we have a lot of inventory changes, in other words, we want to buy more inventory because we think sales are going to rise, that is going to impact investment. On the other hand, if we think it's going to fall, then we're going to reduce inventory and plan it, and it'll actually go negative. In other words, we won't buy any until we work some of this off, and that's going to have a negative impact on investment. And of course, expectations will impact investment, and probably, in all honesty, have a lot to do with those planned inventory changes. Right now, stores are gearing up for Christmas. Well, they've already got their inventory there, but whatever they've ordered is based on their expectation of what they're going to sell at Christmas. Do they know? No, but they have an expectation. So if expectations improve, then investment is going to tend to go up. If they get bad or worse, it's going to go down. Finally, I have a comment on these, the other two items, government consumption and net exports. We're going to deal with those a little bit later, but when we get into fiscal policy, because government consumption is going to be what we use to actually boost the economy. And it won't really be dependent on anything except the decisions of government, and we will just simply state that, government consumption is whatever the government decides it's going to be. We'll treat net exports as a given, and we'll discuss what impacts those net exports a little bit later. But they really won't be of much consequence to us because we're not as concerned about them as you would be in courses, for instance, where you had more discussion of international trade. So in this chapter, we've discussed the four components with most of the emphasis on consumption and investment. In the next chapter, we're going to develop something called an aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. Now, a concept that shows why these components are so powerful is something called the multiplier. The multiplier suggests an increase in either consumption, not brought about by increase in income, or in other words, consumption changes caused by changes in the non-income determinants, or investment will have an impact well beyond the immediate expenditure. So let me give you an example. Assume you're a business and you decide to make an investment such as building onto your current building. You hire workers and you buy materials. Let us assume you pay workers $10,000. They take that money and they spend part and they save part. How much do they spend? Well, that depends on the MPC. So let's assume our MPC is 0.9. So that means out of the $10,000 you pay them, they consume 0.9 or 90% of it, or $9,000. They're going to take that to the grocery store, the furniture store, the bar, and that means the business owners now have $9,000 they didn't have before. What do they do with it? They spend it. How much? 90% or $8,100 out of that $9,000. When they spend the $8,100, the recipient of that $8,100 will spend 90% or $7,290. That means we have now increased income by not only the original $10,000, the original investment, but now we've increased consumption by $9,000 plus $8,100 plus $7,290, or $24,390 plus the $10,000, or we had an increase of $34,390. This means GDP rises by a multiple of the original investment, and it will continue to rise until we have used all of that up. So the total increase is going to be equal to the $10,000 times 1 over 1 minus CMPC, or $10,000 times 1 over 0.1, which is equal to $100,000. Now our multiplier is equal to the 1 over 1 minus the MPC, or that's also 1 over the MPS. And we can see the original investment has had an impact much greater than the amount originally spent. Note, this can also be negative, meaning if investment declines, the impact will be the change in investment times the multiplier, and that investment's negative. This explains why the instability of investment is such a problem. If you look in areas where a plant is closed, most people say, well, it doesn't affect me, because, gosh, I don't work there. Well, what happens is then the workers don't have money. They don't spend it at the grocery stores. They don't spend it at the hardware stores. They don't spend it at the restaurants. And more people lose their jobs. When I came here over 30 years ago, things were horribly bad because all the farm machinery companies had closed. And the economy here was pretty much a disaster. So that means that there was a multiplier effect. Now, local multipliers tend to be smaller than national multipliers, because obviously if I get some of that income, maybe I'll go to Iowa City and spend it, so it's not affecting the local area as much. So some of it will drain away. So what are some issues with the multiplier? Well, the concept of the multiplier has been used for many years. It also has been questioned as to how useful it is and how large it is. Now, the example we gave implied a multiplier of 10, 1 over 0.1. It's probably a good measure of the impact that private investment has, but it's very debatable about whether government consumption and spending may have that large a multiplier, although we always have assumed that. In fact, in some cases, we've actually assumed it's larger. But some economists have estimated the size of the government expenditure multiplier at less than 1. Many economists agree. Now, why do they think it's so small or less than 1? Well, the reason they think that is simply because in order for government to spend, they have to take it out of the private sector. Now, later we'll discuss that. It's called crowding out. So, for instance, if the government takes $1 away from me and then they spend it, what's happened? Not much. Because that means I have less income, I consume less, they consume more. Same with investment. If taxes take money away from companies that we're going to invest, then that simply wipes out that investment, and the government spends it, so it may not have any impact at all. Those are things we'll discuss a little bit later, but I just wanted to bring your attention